September the 12th if you're in the southern hemisphere, and if you're in the northern hemisphere, it's obviously September 11th. You all seem to be Ben Vidgen on the Deadline Report, Fresh FM, and I'm going to do my show today. Is actually recorded in the state specifically to mark the anniversary of the attack on the Twin Towers. And this show, and possibly even two, or even possibly three, if that's what it takes, are going to be basically my shows about the state and the nature of terrorism, beginning with the Twin Towers. Now, my own journey to the Twin Towers, uh, well, it's a fairly long journey. I grew up in Christchurch. I went, I went to live with my father when I was in Christchurch in my teenage years, did all my schooling, all my university there. I did my degree in political science and history. Um, and during that time, I devoted those double major to the study of terrorism. So every paper that we wrote, I'd go to the lecture and say, "Can I do this on this terrorism?" And 90% of the time, they'd say yes. So I concluded my final year by doing a dissertation on the history of terrorism. I think a period covers the 1960s to the 1990s, looking at specifically the history of Middle Eastern and Western European terrorist groups. So there was a point in my life where I could rattle off every single sector, religion, and so on, and a lot of the stuff I haven't looked at in years, but a lot of it has changed, but there's still a lot that I actually remember. In fact, one of my lecturers was a gentleman called Kerry Nederman, who, half jokingly, half serious, made me watch The Life of Brian, which was conveyed the Monty Python lampooning, but it conveyed the point he was trying to make was that terrorist groups and organisations that have made use of violence, literally almost as old as mankind itself. The first thing you obviously learn to define is when you look about terrorism is, well, what actually is terrorism? And the name itself is actually, it's fairly self-explanatory. It's the attempt to make use of, or the threat of coercion of violence, which is largely inspired to make people feel frightened, at which point you are, trying to through that emotion of fear, steer them in one direction, or a goal, or objective. So this is what you learn with political science, and I went off there, and I at the same time was in the New Zealand Territorials, and I was originally attached to artillery intelligence, but because there wasn't really a lot happening in artillery intelligence, I used to go off and participate in different intelligence groups, the Force Intelligence Group, the Counterintelligence, and during this period, of course, we had exercises like Operation Golden Fleece, Operation Lawman, which are all basically counter-terrorist exercises. So I basically was at university. I had a practical and a field training in the study of basically counterinsurgency, effectively. My first article I wrote was in 1995, and it was for an international magazine called Nexus, which is, it's a fringe publication, and I've always ended up being a fringe journalist. It is what it is. But that was called A State of Terror, and specifically what I'm looking at that particular time was the links between Islamic terrorist organizations, which at that time was 1995. We were looking specifically at the organizations Al Qaeda, and in my article, we basically look at how Al Qaeda was originally, goes back to the Muslim Brotherhood, and then the Muslim Brotherhood goes back to the Al-Bana network. And the Al-Bana network was, prior to the end of World War II, largely in the hands of the Nazi Germany. It was actually run by the Gestapo as an intelligence saboteur network. And at the end of the war, their intelligence assets were largely seized by the Americans. Now, Robert Loftus, who is an American lawyer for the CIA, in the sense they paid him $1 at that point, he became their lawyer, is very known for his work on outing um, neo-Nazis into the US via South America, what they call the rat line. And he makes the point in a conversation where he's talking to Robert Bayer, who is a member of the CIA, who again wrote a book, that during his time there was abundance of archives on the Albania network, which became known as the Muslim Brotherhood. Um, Robert Bayer makes the point, well, when he was in the CIA, which is when he was being stationed in Bosnia, there was zero. All those files had literally gone poof, vanished in a puff of thin air. Um, Bosnia comes up because of my article, A State of Terror. I'm writing effectively about how a shipment of weapons have been brought into this United Nations, nation that's under the United Nations arms embargo, of which when I interviewed the UN Human Rights Commissioner, Hugh Linfield, I think. It's in my book, State Secrets. That's on my website, so you feel free to load the free PDF down there. Um, so he says that 95% of the weapons that arrived in Bosnia actually were either made by the French, the Americans, the Russians. In other words, the top 5 security members of the United Nations that were launching this arms embargo were the biggest offenders of shipping weapons, including a massive shipment of weapons that were funded by Islamic nations, but given the green light by the Clinton administration, so that up to and in turn, those weapons which were provided to what became the Muslim Brigade, which was led by Dr. Al-Zawahiri, Dr. Armin Zawahiri, otherwise known as Osama bin Laden's number 2, that 30% of those weapons actually ended up in the hands of the Croatian HAVO. And this is the organization that during World War II were again allied with the neo-Nazis, and also people like Dr. Pavelic assisted in getting the Nazis out to South America and into America, where they either worked in the American science rocket program or they were involved in America's intelligence apparatus. The Gestapo, for example, so the CIA was actually originally founded on literally the blueprint models of the Gestapo. As I think it's written original pieces for the Chicago Tribune, and I think the author is William Donovan, but I'm going from memory, so look, if it's not there, you Google it, it's not there, then you know I've got it wrong, but it's definitely the author of the Chicago Tribune. That's basically what interesting, because not only was that the CIA based on this whole Gestapo model, largely thanks to the efforts of people like Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the German intelligence service after the war, but during the war had served under Adolf Hitler. He claims he wasn't Gestapo, but effectively the organizations he operated with were run by the Gestapo. And so effectively people like him ended up helping create the new American intelligence apparatus. It is interesting to the point about that rat line too, of course, is that the rat line, the rat line into the United States involved also members of the neo-Nazi that would then go on to be part of the post-Cold War paramilitary units like Gladio, which then carried out terrorist attacks in Europe through P2, which we'll get into the next section. But that all goes back to a very unknown but important meeting which actually occurred on November 23rd, 1945, as the war is coming to an end at a hotel in Germany called the Rathhausen, which is German for the Red House, as documented by in declassified OSS documents, the intelligence service of the Allies during the war, that the chief industrialists of Germany at that time, including companies from IGB and Farben, who we know today as Bayer Pharmaceuticals, and companies like Krupp Industries, which is an armaments industry, and BMW, met with high-ranking members of the Gestapo and the SS, including a Dr. Scheider, which some people have alluded to was actually a nom de plume for Reinhard Gehlen, the head of the German intelligence service. But that withstanding, the meeting turned around and effectively said that the Nazis had accepted they'd lost the battle, but they were not willing to accept that they had lost the war, and they planned to take looted money out of Germany via these rat lines, which I've said to you before about Robert Loftus, and then funnel them into companies that had either been neutral or nations that were allied to the Germans during the Nazi period, and that they planned to carry on fighting a war that would be, this time around, it would be an economic-based war. And we'll come back to that in a second, because we'll have a little bit of a break. But what many of you may not know is that September 11, aside from being the date of which Allende was overthrown by far-right CIA-backed elements in South America, where a lot of the CIA-backed neo-Nazis ended up being head of security or backing up dictatorships. So September 11th was the date of that invasion, largely as architecture of Henry Kissinger, who will again come back to in the next element. But it was also the date that the Americans, it's the anniversary date of when the Americans first entered Nazi Germany in 1944. So it's actually an anniversary of the day that the Americans kicked the Nazis' asses, and now it's the day we associate with the biggest terrorist attack or significant event since Pearl Harbor. I'm now going to take a little bit of a break. We're going to listen to the UK band WW2, one of my all-time favourite go-to bands. We are going to listen to Islam is Rising off the album Soul Mining. You're on the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen, and this is Fresh FM. And you're back on Fresh FM with Ben Vidgen on the Deadline Report. We're doing a series of shows of today, which I'm going to be recording on the anniversary, September 11th. I'm beginning today with the My Road, we're called to My Road to 9/11. I've just explained the history of a lot of the Islamic organizations that we know today as things like Al-Qaeda actually have their origins back in World War II within a association with the neo-Nazi organizations. And this is actually an interesting connection, because in New Zealand, there's always just been, since the Christchurch event, the line has been, oh, we had no idea that this was going to go, we weren't looking at these people. I don't know why, because in my first article, State of Terror for Nexus magazine, which basically became the draft document, which eventually would become my book, State Secrets, which I sold in 1999. I published it in 1999. It was the #2 New Zealand bestseller on the Sunday Star Times list of bestsellers for several months, along with on the #2 for Whitgill's New Zealand non-fiction bestsellers. And throughout that book, which largely was given a media blackout to use the description that scoop occurred, I make again and again a reference to the fact that the far right, or the neo-Nazi organizations, are very, very powerful, and they are still very much pulling the strings and have very, very close connections with the Western intelligence community, which, again, as I explained in the previous show, had this affiliation with also a neo-Nazi element via things like the Rat Line. Now, after the war, the Americans became very afraid of the Soviet Union, and they went about setting up what they called a stay-behind army, or an army of secret soldiers, if you want, made up of people that were saboteurs and assassins, and these were people that were very, very qualified and had been during the war, killers. And who they turned to was they turned to former members of the neo-Nazis and the Italian fascist movement, and they set them up into terror cells. So all throughout Europe, you had in France the founding group behind the OAS, which later went on to challenge Charles de Gaulle, the president of France, cause major disruptions in France during the 1970s. You had in Italy, in Spain, you had GAL, which was called Death to Terrorists. This was actually led by Otto Skorzeny, who was the bodyguard to Adolf Hitler, and would go on to set up a mercenary unit called Paladin, which again has significance in my 9/11 road and a road to Christchurch, which we'll get to when we come around to that show. But do remember the name Paladin. You had the most famous one probably was, however, was Propaganda Duo, which was established in Italy and led by Licio Gilli, who was a former member of the Italian fascists. But Licio Gilli, or the P2 movement, it was of course all part of this greater umbrella, which was known as Gladio, meaning Latin for the sword, whose original architect was Henry Kissinger, the Secretary of State under the United States presidents. In fact, I think he did Nixon, Johnson, and not sure about Kennedy, but I know he served under at least 4 of the American presidents, and basically was very much a uber hawk who basically advocated for all sorts of cloak and dagger material for the CIA to engage, which included this organization called Gladio, which had these splinter cells throughout Europe of far-right paramilitary elements. Now, in the case of P2, P2 would then go on to become responsible for the highest level of fatalities. They were the most violent terrorist organization, bar none, in the 1980s. There was no organization that killed more people than P2, although they are largely, today, even in the world of Uncle Google and Auntie YouTube, unheard of. Nobody refers to these people, even though they have this huge level of carnage. And it's also incredible because at the time when this stuff was actually literally on the front pages of newspapers and international newspapers, what they discovered with P2 was it led to a investigation of P2, eventually to massive corruption investigations within the state of Italy, which was overseen by Italian magistrates who turned out to be some exceptionally brave people, because they were dealing with very, very, very powerful people. The chief magistrate, unfortunately, I should remember his name out of pure respect, but in the end, his limousine would be blown into bits that they picked up 3 miles away from the blast crater. So, the price of justice was very steep, and he outed the fact that P2, which included the arrest of Licio Gelli, but it also included the fact that they had senior members of the Italian government, members of the NATO alliance, the intelligence services, the military, celebrities, were all part of the secret organization which dressed itself in the garb of Freemasonry, which became a very significant event for the British public. We had Operation Tiberius, and in the United Kingdom, perhaps the appreciation of Masonry as a tool for infiltration or nepotism is probably said more appreciated in England than it is in New Zealand, where it's sort of, again, this paradox and hypocrisy, where we go, oh, we had no idea about white supremacists and neo-Nazis, and we must, crack down on these alt-right people. Well, I completely agree, but this is exactly what this Masonic network of old boys and their patriarch is entirely about. So for us not to take them seriously, especially when they consider that these people often have access to massive resources, is quite curious, especially in this age where we're so keen to actually, nip anything in the bud that we want to put this label on it. If you critique the government, you must be outright. And yet, in this case of an organization that is clearly conservative in nature of its politics, secret, dominated by white males, they get a free pass. And this is very interesting. But back to P2. So P2 was led by Licio Gelli, who then fled to Lugano in Switzerland, and I believe there is a super lodge in Switzerland today in Lugano. And Lugano was very significant in terms of New Zealand, because this is where the fugitive and arms runner Simon Spitz had been running weapons out of Lugano airport, flying them all around, Russian weapons on Antonovs, flying them all around to Africa, supplying them to Islamic warlords, supplying them to in warlords are responsible for genocide in places like Somalia and genocide in um, Rwanda. Lugano was also, as I said, the lodge of P2, this group that was actually overseen by Gladio, the architecture of CIA, and it was where the bank Al-Taqwa would be established, which would handle the finance for the men that would execute the terrorist attack on 9/11, and it was run by a banker called Ahmed Humer, a former German who had been converted to Islam and was also a member of a former, I think he was SS, but he was a neo-Nazi, a member of these neo-Nazi underground movements, who is said to have said that in his meeting room of Al-Taqwa, which is this little, almost a halal-style bank, there was an oil painting of Osama bin Laden, a man who had family had been previously close to the Americans and helped the Americans in Afghanistan fight the Soviets during the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. But there would also be a oil painting of Adolf Hitler as this attack would be launched on the anniversary of the American invasion of Nazi Germany. And when you start to look at a lot of these elements within 9/11, you start to realize that there is actually a very neo-Nazi component to this. And we'll come back to that next week when we start to talk about the links between the right-wing terrorism within the Pacific in the lead up to the Christchurch attack on March 15th. I think we will leave it at that today, and we will go out with a little bit, probably won't have time to play the whole lot, but we'll play Midnight Oil's Short Memory, which is, I love that song because it kind of alludes to all this corruption and events that happen again and again, and why any of this should shock us or surprise us. When you look back at the last 40 to 50 years of history, there's good grounds for people to be suspicious of the state and to believe that the official narrative is not always true, because that's what history shows us to be, again, repeatedly. Short Memory, Midnight Oil. You're listening to Ben Vidgen on the Deadline Report. This is on Fresh FM. Do feel free to check out my website, just Ben Vidgen, Postman Productions. We have a little donation box, so feel free to put a little donation in there if you like what you've been listening to and you want to keep the show continuing. Thank you very much, and stay safe out there.